The notification came at 6:47 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I had just turned off my alarm, the one I set for 6:45 every weekday without fail, and was lying in the gray half-light of my bedroom, watching the ceiling and thinking about the Henderson acquisition call I had scheduled for 9 o'clock. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand. A soft, unremarkable sound. The kind that carries nothing with it. I reached over without looking and set it face down again, the way I always do when I'm not ready to let the day begin. My name is Sarah. I'm 34 years old, and I have spent the last decade of my life building something from wreckage. I didn't reach for the phone again for another 20 minutes. When I finally did, I saw that the notification wasn't an email from a client. It wasn't a calendar reminder. It wasn't even my news app. It was a group chat I hadn't known existed until that moment, and the preview line showed enough. Just enough. Patricia, we need to confirm the Thursday slot before she realizes. Jay says the attorney will. The message cut off there, the way previews always do. A sentence dangling over an edge. I sat up. The duvet slid off my shoulders. The room was cold in the way October mornings are cold in the city, not brutal, just persistent, and I sat on the edge of my bed in my pajamas, phone in both hands, and read that preview line 4 more times. Not because I didn't understand it, but because some part of me was still trying to decide whether understanding it would cost me something I wasn't prepared to lose. I'm the CFO and majority shareholder of Nolan Properties. 60% of the company belongs to me. I rebuilt it after my father died 10 years ago, when I was 24 and the business was barely solvent and my mother had no idea what a line of credit was. I restructured the debt. I renegotiated the contracts. I brought in new investors and spent 3 years working 16-hour days in an office that smelled like old carpet and stale coffee until the company finally, quietly, became something worth having. My mother's name is Patricia. My sister's name is Jessica. She is 29 and works, nominally, in the company's marketing division, a role that was created specifically to give her somewhere to be. Thursday was my birthday. I set the phone down on the bed beside me and looked at my hands. They were completely steady. That surprised me, even then, the steadiness. I think I had been waiting for something like this for longer than I knew. Not this specific thing, but something. The shape of it was familiar in the way that the thing you've been dreading always feels familiar when it finally arrives. Not new exactly. Just finally visible. I put the phone in my desk drawer and went to make coffee. What I didn't do, what I should have done, was open the chat immediately and read every message. But I didn't. I made coffee. I showered. I dressed in the gray blazer I wore when I needed to feel capable, and I drove to the office, and I sat through the Henderson call with both hands flat on the conference table, and I answered every question with the same precision I always brought to those conversations. The drawer stayed closed until evening. Looking back now, that delay was its own kind of answer. I already knew, on some level, that what was in that chat would change the architecture of everything I'd built, not just professionally, but personally. And I wasn't ready to lose the last ordinary morning I had left. That's the thing no one tells you about the moments just before a revelation. You feel them coming. Your body knows before your mind agrees. I had been feeling something shift for months, something low and quiet, like a pressure change before a storm, and I had been choosing, very deliberately, not to name it. I told myself it was work stress. I told myself my mother was just difficult, the way she had always been difficult. I told myself my sister was young and still finding her footing, that she'd grow into herself eventually. I had a remarkable talent for converting warning signs into explanations that didn't require me to act on them. Nolan Properties was my father's company before it was mine. He built it in the 80s with borrowed money and an almost aggressive faith in commercial real estate, and when he died of a cardiac event at 58, he left behind a business with serious cash flow problems, a grieving wife who had never once managed a household budget, and 2 daughters, one of whom had just finished her MBA and one of whom had just started high school. I was the MBA. My father and I had been close in the specific, quiet way that fathers and eldest daughters sometimes are, more partners than parent and child, or at least that's how it felt to me. He used to call me into his study on Sunday evenings and show me the quarterly numbers, explaining margins and vacancies and cost per acquisition as though I were a colleague rather than a teenager. I had loved those evenings with an intensity one didn't fully understand until they were gone. When he died, I made a decision. I don't remember it feeling like a decision at the time. It felt more like an inevitability, like gravity. Someone had to take the company. Someone had to keep the family from sliding into a financial situation that couldn't be recovered from. My mother was devastated and completely lost. Jessica was 15 and crying into her pillow every night. I was 24, and I had a degree, and I had 10 years of Sunday evening education from a man who believed I could do anything. So I did. In 10 years, I had contributed more than $2 million to the family's collective lifestyle, mortgage payments on the house my mother refused to downsize, private school fees for Jessica's final years of high school, university tuition, a car my sister had wanted because her friend had one, holidays I had paid for and not attended because I was always working, a kitchen renovation my mother had decided she needed, and 100 smaller things I no longer tracked because tracking them had started to feel like keeping score in a game I hadn't agreed to play. I had never once asked for acknowledgement. I had simply assumed, and here was my blind spot, the one I returned to again and again when I try to understand what happened. I had simply assumed that love was being demonstrated through action. That what I gave was being received as love. That somewhere inside my mother's careful management of her own comfort, she understood what I was doing and was grateful for it, even if she never said so. The drawer stayed closed all day. I drove home at 7:30, ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter, and then sat down at my desk in the quiet of my study and opened it. The phone was exactly where I had left it. The group chat was called Family First. I had never been added to it. I need to tell you what ordinary looked like before everything collapsed, because without it the collapse makes no sense. My mornings began at 6:45. I ran 3 miles, showered, made French press coffee in a kitchen that I had furnished myself with pieces I'd chosen slowly over 5 years, a table from a reclaimed wood place in the warehouse district, chairs I'd found at an estate sale, and had reupholstered in dark green linen. I had a small collection of succulents on the windowsill that I tended with more care than I gave most human relationships. The apartment was quiet and organized and mine, and I spent as little time in it as possible. Work was where I lived. The office of Nolan Properties occupied the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, and I arrived there by 8 most mornings and rarely left before 7. I had good relationships with our major clients, Marcus Webb in particular, who handled 3 of our largest commercial leases, and David Chin, who had brought us 2 significant investment partnerships in the past 18 months. These were men who trusted my judgment because my judgment had never failed them. That trust was the thing I was most certain of in my life. My mother called on Sundays. The calls lasted between 12 and 20 minutes, and their content was consistent. What she needed, what Jessica was doing, occasional mentions of the house, and a brief inquiry into my health that functioned as a social formality rather than genuine interest. I answered everything she asked and volunteered nothing she didn't. These calls had felt normal to me for so long that I had stopped noticing their shape. Looking back now, the shape was everything. She never asked about my work. In 10 years of Sunday calls, my mother had never once asked me about a deal I was working on, a difficulty I was navigating, a decision I was proud of. She asked about my health the way you ask a service provider if everything is running smoothly. Functional. Transactional. Jessica called less often, and when she did it was usually because she wanted something. A budget approval for a campaign idea. An advance on her salary. Once, memorably, a recommendation letter for a friend of hers who wanted to apply for a commercial space in one of our buildings, a request that mixed the personal and the professional in a way that made me mildly uncomfortable. Though I wrote the letter anyway. The first sign, the one I should have caught, came 3 months before my birthday. I was in the office on a Wednesday afternoon, reviewing contracts with our property manager, when I got a call from Harold Weston. Harold had been my father's attorney for 20 years before becoming mine, and he occupied the rare category of people I trusted completely. He was 71, formal in the way that generation tends to be formal, and he had the particular quality of never saying anything he hadn't already considered from 4 different angles. "Sarah," he said, when I picked up, "I wanted to make you aware of something. Your mother contacted my office last week." I straightened in my chair. "For what?" "She requested a copy of the shareholder agreement." I paused. "She's not a shareholder." "No, she is not." A brief silence on his end. "I declined to provide it, naturally. But I thought you should know she asked." I thanked him and ended the call and sat for a long moment looking out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Then I filed the information away in the mental folder labeled things to think about later and turned back to the contracts. That folder, I now understand, was where I put everything I wasn't ready to act on. I didn't mention it to my mother on Sunday. I didn't bring it up with Jessica. I told myself it was probably nothing, that my mother had been curious about something financial and hadn't thought through the appropriate channel for the inquiry. I told myself she meant no harm by it. The second sign came 6 weeks later at the family dinner my mother hosted the first Sunday of every month. These dinners were a ritual she had maintained since my father died, and I attended them without fail because skipping them felt like a concession I wasn't willing to make, a surrender to the truth that our relationship had become more obligation than connection. The dining room smelled of roast chicken and the particular floral candle my mother burned at every gathering, a scent I associated so completely with those evenings that encountering it anywhere else felt disorienting. The table was set formally, the way she always set it, cloth napkins, the good china, a centerpiece she changed seasonally. I arrived with wine. Jessica was already there, sitting at the kitchen counter scrolling her phone, and she glanced up when I came in with the particular expression she had perfected over years, not unfriendly exactly, but not interested either. Like I was a piece of furniture she'd learned to navigate around. "You look tired," she said. "I've been working." "You're always working." She said it without malice, which somehow made it worse. It wasn't a criticism. It was an observation. As though being always working was a fixed trait of mine, like eye color, rather than a choice I was making on behalf of people sitting in this kitchen. Dinner was fine. My mother talked about a redesign she was considering for the back garden. Jessica talked about a trip she was planning with friends, somewhere Mediterranean, I gathered, though the details drifted past me. I ate my chicken and contributed where I was expected to contribute, and at some point my mother reached across the table and patted my hand in a gesture that felt rehearsed, and said, "We don't know what we'd do without you, darling." I smiled. I said something modest. And something in me noticed, registered, catalogued, filed, that the words felt hollow in a specific way. Not warm. Not real. The way someone says a prayer they've stopped believing in but continue to recite because the recitation itself is the point. Something inside me had already started to know. I just wasn't ready to listen to it yet. The weeks between that dinner and my birthday passed in the way busy weeks do, quickly and without ceremony. I closed the Henderson deal. I had 2 long calls with David Chin about an investment opportunity in the Harbor District. I ran my miles and tended my succulents and answered my mother's Sunday calls, and I did not think about the shareholder agreement request, and I did not think about Harold's call, and I did not think about the hollow sound of my mother saying, "We don't know what we'd do without you." I was good at not thinking about things I couldn't resolve. In the week before my birthday, my mother mentioned, during our Sunday call, that she was planning a small gathering at the house. She was vague about the details, a few of her friends, she said, and maybe some of Jessica's, a nice dinner, nothing too formal. She mentioned it the way you mention weather, informatively, without expectation of response. "Sounds lovely," I said. "Yes," she agreed and moved on. She did not mention that it was my birthday. She did not ask whether I had plans of my own. The gathering at the house floated there in the conversation like an unanchored fact, and I let it float, and we talked about the garden redesign for another 5 minutes, and then we said goodbye. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in the underground parking garage for a long time. I told myself it was an oversight, that she'd assumed I knew the party was for me, that the vagueness was just my mother being my mother, practical and not especially warm, but fundamentally well-meaning. I had been making that argument for 10 years. It was very practiced by now. Very smooth. I could deliver it to myself in under 30 seconds and feel, if not reassured, at least stable enough to continue. But sitting in that garage, engine off, I noticed something I couldn't quite argue away. I felt nothing at the prospect of my own birthday party. Not anticipation. Not warmth. Just a quiet, familiar weight, the way you feel arriving somewhere you've been too many times, somewhere that has never quite felt like home. The group chat was called Family First, and it had 47 messages I hadn't seen. I opened it on the evening of the day I'd found the preview notification, sitting at my desk with the lamp on and the rest of the apartment dark. I had made tea not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to do with my hands while I read. The chat included my mother, my sister, and two people I didn't recognize by their numbers. I scrolled to the beginning. The first message was from my mother, sent 6 weeks earlier, the week after Harold's call, I realized, with a jolt that felt physical. Patricia, Harold refused to provide the document. We'll need to approach this differently. Jay, can you ask David Chin about the valuation process? He trusts you. I set down the tea. My sister's response came 4 minutes later, on it. I'll reach out this week. He invited me to that thing at the Meridian next month, so timing is good. The Meridian. That was a client event I had organized. David Chin had been on my guest list. I scrolled forward. Over the following weeks, the chat painted a picture I had to read 3 times before I fully accepted it. My mother and sister and the 2 unknown numbers, one of whom appeared to be a financial consultant named Jay, had been meeting informally to discuss the possibility of acquiring enough shares to reduce my controlling interest. The plan, as it emerged across 47 messages, was not yet fully formed. But the direction was clear. They wanted leverage. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted options. What they were planning to do on Thursday, on my birthday, was meet with a potential buyer for Jessica's minority shares, someone who had expressed interest in gaining a foothold in Nolan Properties. If that sale went through, combined with any additional shares they might maneuver, the dynamic would shift. They weren't trying to take the company from me overnight. They were trying to create enough counterweight that I could be outvoted on key decisions. That I could be managed. That the majority I'd built and held for 10 years could be quietly diluted while I sat in my office closing deals that funded the very maneuver designed to diminish me. I read the whole conversation twice. Then I put the phone down and looked at the wall. The most recent message was from Jessica. Sent the day before. Don't forget to send her the birthday text tomorrow. Has to look normal. My mother had responded with a single heart emoji. The tea had gone cold. I have thought many times about what I felt in that moment, and I still find it difficult to describe with precision. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even surprise, exactly, not the explosive kind. It was more like a gradual, terrible clarity. The way fog lifts not suddenly but incrementally, each layer removing until the shape underneath is finally and completely visible. I had been invisible to them for 10 years. Not neglected by accident, not overlooked by carelessness, but systematically excluded from their inner world while being relied upon as the financial engine that powered it. They had looked at me, at everything I had done, and seen a resource. A mechanism. Something to be managed and, when necessary, outmaneuvered. I understood, sitting in the lamplight of my study, that the dinner parties and Sunday calls, and we don't know what we'd do without you had never been expressions of love. They had been maintenance. The minimum required to keep the mechanism running. That realization settled into me like cold water. I didn't cry. I noted, clinically, that I was not crying and found it significant. I had spent years being afraid to examine this too closely. Some part of me had always known that what I called a family relationship was something more transactional than that, but acknowledging it fully would have required me to reckon with what it meant about my own choices. About the years I had given. About the love I had performed for people who had, from the very beginning, received it primarily as a financial service. The 2 unknown numbers continued to bother me. I spent the next 2 days doing what I had always done when I encountered a problem. I gathered information. The financial consultant, Jay, was easy enough to identify through context clues in the messages. He had attended a meeting at my mother's house on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks earlier. Jessica had referenced Jay's recommendation regarding the share structure. I pulled the list of financial advisors who had made inquiries about Nolan Properties in the past year and found 3 names with the initial J. One of them had left a voicemail with our office manager that I hadn't personally returned, assuming it was a cold approach. I returned it now. The conversation confirmed what I suspected. This was someone my mother had independently engaged to advise her on company shareholding structures. He had done nothing illegal. Advising a family member on financial options was entirely legitimate, but the secrecy of his engagement, the routing around official channels, the attempt to gather information Harold had correctly refused to provide, told me everything I needed to understand about the intent. The second unknown number I traced to a property development company based in another city. A company that had made 2 approaches to Nolan Properties in the past 4 years, both of which I had declined, politely and firmly, because their model conflicted with our long-term direction. They were being invited back through a side door. The thing that struck me most, the detail I kept returning to, was how long this had been in motion before I accidentally glimpsed it. 6 weeks of messages at minimum. Probably longer in conversation, before anyone had committed to a group chat. My mother and sister had sat across from me at the monthly dinners. They had called on Sundays. They had sent Christmas gifts and birthday texts, and all of it, had been overlaid on a layer of planning they had never considered sharing with me. I called Harold on a Wednesday morning, from my car in the parking garage, the engine running. "I need an appointment," I said. "Not at the office. Somewhere private." He paused for only a moment. "My home," he said. "Thursday at 9. I'll be there." I drove to the office. I sat through 2 meetings. I approved a lease renewal and signed off on a maintenance contract. My assistant, who had worked with me for 3 years and knew my face better than most people, brought me coffee and said, "Quiet day," and I said yes and meant it in every possible sense. There was one moment, one I'm not proud of, where I considered doing nothing. Simply letting it unfold, waiting to see what Thursday's meeting produced, maintaining the performance of normalcy until I had more information. The strategic argument was sound. I held 60%. Whatever they arranged could ultimately be countered. The rational move was patience. But I had been patient for 10 years. And patience, I was beginning to understand, had not been a strategy. It had been a habit. A habit built on the hope that if I was useful enough, steady enough, present enough, something would eventually shift, some recognition would come, some warmth would finally become real. That hope was gone now. And without it, patience felt like something else entirely. Harold Weston lived in a house that had the quiet authority of old money and long tenure, a narrow terrace in the older part of the city, with a garden wall and window boxes that someone still tended carefully. He opened the door before I knocked, which told me he had been watching for my car. His study smelled of wood polish and printer paper. He poured coffee without asking and set a cup in front of me and waited. I told him everything. The notification. The chat. The 47 messages. The financial consultant. The out-of-city development company. I spoke for nearly 20 minutes without stopping, and Harold sat with his hands folded on the desk and listened with the stillness of a man who has heard many difficult things and knows that interrupting them helps no one. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The shareholder agreement is airtight," he said. "Your 60% is not negotiable through any mechanism they could arrange without your consent. Any sale of Jessica's shares requires your approval under the current structure, a provision your father specifically included, and which I was careful to maintain when we updated the document after his death. They don't know that." Evidently not. He picked up his coffee cup. "Which suggests they engage someone who either didn't do their research or is guiding them in a direction they find profitable regardless of outcome." I thought about Jay's voicemail. About the development company who stood to gain from any foothold in Nolan Properties, even an inconclusive one. "The party," I said. Harold looked at me steadily. "Tell me about the party." I explained what I knew, that my mother was hosting a gathering on Thursday at the house, that she had described it vaguely to me as a friendly dinner, that the group chat contained references to using the event as a cover. A social occasion that would explain why people were at the house if anyone asked later. Marcus Webb's name appeared in the chat. So did David Chen's. They had been invited, I realized, by my mother and sister, using connections they had made through my professional network. Marcus will be there, I said. And David. Harold set his cup down very carefully. Do they know why they've been invited? I don't think so. The messages suggest they were told it's a birthday celebration for me. Something shifted in Harold's expression. Not quite anger, Harold was too measured for that, but a tightening around the eyes that I had never seen before. They used your birthday and your professional relationships as staging for a financial meeting they planned to conduct in your absence. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, what would you like to do, Sarah? I had thought about this for 2 days. I had turned it over from every angle, the way I turn over a difficult acquisition, examining the pressure points, the timing, the variables I could control and those I couldn't. I had made a mistake earlier in my career, in the first years of rebuilding the company, of moving too quickly on a bad property because I'd been emotionally attached to the opportunity. The lesson had been expensive. I wasn't going to move too quickly now. I'm going to the party, I said. Harold looked at me without expression. I'm going to arrive in professional dress with the documentation that establishes my role and standing in the company. I'm going to let Marcus and David see that I'm there. And I'm going to let my mother and sister explain, in front of the people they invited to impress, why I wasn't supposed to know about any of this. You want them to expose themselves. I want the truth to be visible, I said. In front of witnesses they chose. Harold considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll prepare a brief statement of your position and shareholding. Something you can reference if necessary. And if it would help to have me present. It would help, I said. I drove back to the office. I ate lunch at my desk. I answered 11 emails, approved a contract amendment, and responded to a message from Marcus Webb confirming his attendance at Patricia Nolan's birthday dinner, an invitation I had not issued, to a party I had not organized, for a birthday that was mine. I noted that my hands were steady. They had been steady since the morning I'd found the notification. Steadiness under pressure was the thing I was best at. It had served me professionally for 10 years. It had also, I was beginning to understand, served as excellent camouflage for a kind of emotional paralysis, a deeply practiced ability to function through pain by pretending the pain was simply information to be managed. The difference now was that I wasn't pretending it was something to be managed. I was letting it be what it was. Sitting with it. Not filing it away. That felt new. Uncomfortable in the specific way that new things are uncomfortable, not bad, exactly, but unfamiliar. Like using a muscle you'd been told for years wasn't needed. My birthday morning arrived gray and cold, the sky low with clouds that couldn't decide whether to rain. I made coffee. I ran my miles in the drizzle, which I never usually did. I ran on a treadmill when it rained. But I wanted the cold air and the wet pavement and the physical sensation of weather, something real and unmanaged pressing against me. My phone buzzed at 10:14. My mother's text. Happy birthday, sweetheart. See you tonight. Dress nicely, we're having some friends over XX. At 10:22, my sister's text. Happy birthday, sis. See you later. I responded to both with appropriate warmth and then opened Harold's contact and sent a single message, confirmed for this evening. 7 o'clock. At 4:30 in the afternoon, while I was in my bedroom laying out the charcoal wool suit I had decided to wear, not because it was festive, but because it was armor, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered it because I had been answering all unknown numbers since this began. It was a woman named Diane, who worked in the events coordination team of the development company from another city. She was calling to confirm Patricia Nolan's dinner event and asking whether the terrace at the house would be available for a brief presentation. I told her, in a pleasant and unhurried voice, that I would need to double-check the arrangements for the evening and that I would call her back. I did not call her back. I finished dressing. I made a second coffee. I sat in my quiet kitchen and looked at the succulents on the windowsill, which were thriving, which they always did, because I paid them careful and consistent attention. I thought about my father showing me quarterly numbers on Sunday evenings. About the particular quality of his attention, the way he had looked at me as though my thoughts were worth waiting for. I had spent 10 years trying to earn a version of that feeling from the people he'd left behind. trying to be valued the way he had valued me. That had been my real blind spot. Not the work. Not the money. The belief that value could be purchased through sacrifice. That love, withheld, could eventually be earned. My father had given it freely. That's what I'd been trying to recreate. What I'd never understood was that you can't recreate something in people who were never capable of offering it. I finished the coffee, picked up my bag, and left. The house looked beautiful from the outside. My mother had strung soft lights along the garden wall, the kind that blur at the edges and make everything look warmer than it is. There were cars I didn't recognize in the driveway and on the street. Through the front windows, I could see movement, the warm amber wash of the dining room lights, the shapes of people holding glasses. I stood on the pavement for exactly 30 seconds. Long enough to feel what I felt, which was something between grief and resolve, an emotion I don't have a single word for, and then I walked to the front door and opened it with my key. The hallway smelled of the floral candle and something more elaborate, catered food, the clean edge of good champagne. Someone had arranged flowers on the console table. Expensive ones. White and cream, in the heavy-headed style my mother preferred. I could hear Jessica's laugh from the living room. That bright, practiced laugh she used at social events, a sound I had heard so many times in so many rooms that it had become, for me, the auditory equivalent of a warning light. I walked into the living room. The gathering was larger than I'd expected. 30, perhaps 35 people, my mother's social circle, a few faces I recognized from Jessica's orbit, and, standing near the large windows at the far end of the room, Marcus Webb and David Chin, both holding champagne flutes and deep in conversation with a man I didn't know but recognized from the company profile I had pulled earlier in the week. The development company. Their regional director. No one noticed me immediately. That was predictable and, given the circumstances, useful. My mother was at the center of the room, wearing the midnight blue dress she saved for occasions she considered significant. She was laughing at something someone had said, her head tilted the way she tilted it when she was performing pleasure rather than feeling it. She was, and this struck me with a clarity that felt almost physical, in her element. This was the world she had maintained on my money. These were the friends she had cultivated on my time. This was the life I had been funding from a distance, in exchange for Sunday calls that lasted 20 minutes. Jessica was beside her in a dress I hadn't seen before, pale gold, clearly new. She was holding a glass in one hand and her phone in the other, thumb moving across the screen. Documenting the evening. For Instagram, most likely. Then my mother turned and saw me. The change in her expression was extremely fast. Not slow enough to be caught by anyone who wasn't already watching her carefully. A flicker, something between alarm and rapid recalibration, and then the performance reasserted itself. Sarah. She crossed the room toward me, and her arms opened in the embrace she always gave at family events, wide, brief, and fundamentally empty. She kissed my cheek. She smelled of the perfume Jessica had given her for Christmas. You look wonderful, darling. I'm so glad you made it. Wouldn't miss it, I said. Her eyes moved over my suit. Something in them shifted, an assessment. You're dressed very formally. I came from the office. I had not come from the office. We both knew that. But she nodded and her smile held, and she turned to draw me into the room. Marcus Webb saw me from across the space and lifted his glass in greeting. He began moving toward us, and I watched my mother's expression as he approached, saw the micro-tension that crossed her face. She had not expected me to know Marcus on sight. She had not expected me to navigate this room as someone who belonged in it professionally. Sarah, Marcus said, and shook my hand. I didn't know you'd be here. I thought he paused, a brief social recalibration. Lovely to see you. You too, Marcus. I heard about the invitation. I let that sit for exactly one beat. My mother has been wonderful about bringing my professional contacts together. Marcus looked briefly uncertain. He was a perceptive man. That was part of why I valued the relationship. He could feel when the subtext of a room had a different weight than the surface suggested. Jessica had noticed me now. From across the room, I watched her face go through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and then something that was, I think, the beginning of fear. Harold arrived at 7:15, exactly as arranged. He came in quietly, without announcement, and stood near the entrance to the dining room, present, visible, and saying nothing. His presence was the statement. My mother saw him and went very still. It was David Chin who inadvertently set everything in motion. He approached me with the warmth of someone who genuinely liked me and had no idea what was happening around him, and said, loudly enough to be heard by the small cluster of people nearby, "Sarah, I've been meaning to call you about the Harbor District opportunity. Your team's analysis was excellent. I'd love to move forward. Have you spoken to the other principals?" "I make those decisions directly," I said. "As majority owner and CFO, the Harbor District falls under my portfolio." I let a brief pause follow. "Though I'm happy to copy anyone relevant on our correspondence, of course." The regional director from the development company had drifted closer. I could feel his attention sharpening. "Majority owner," David repeated. He glanced, slightly confused, at my mother, who was standing 6 feet away and whose smile had become a fixed thing, a held expression rather than a real one. 60%, I confirmed pleasantly. Nolan Properties has been under my operational leadership for 10 years. My mother and sister are family members of the founding owner, my late father, but the shareholding and governance structure sit with me. The conversation had gone quiet in our immediate area. Not the whole room. The room was still making its noise, glasses and laughter and someone's anecdote from the far end, but in this cluster of 6 or 7 people, the sound had pulled back like a tide. My mother said, "Sarah," her voice was low. Controlled. But there was something underneath it that I'd never heard there before. Something that sounded remarkably like fear. "I think there may have been some confusion about this evening's purpose," I said, still pleasantly, still addressing the small group around me. "I'm glad to clear that up." Harold stepped forward from near the doorway. He did not raise his voice. Harold never raised his voice. "I'm Harold Weston, longtime legal counsel for Nolan Properties. I'm here on behalf of Sarah Nolan, the company's majority shareholder and chief financial officer." He said it with the economy of a man who has distilled decades of legal practice into the art of saying exactly enough. "If there are any questions about the company's governance structure or shareholding arrangement, I'm happy to address them." The regional director from the development company had gone quite still. He had clearly understood something about the shape of the evening that he had not understood when he arrived. My mother looked at me. In 20 years of looking at her face, I had never seen what was there now. Not anger, she would have known how to manage anger, would have turned it into a performance of wounded matriarchy. This was something beneath anger. Exposure without armor. The particular face of someone who has been seen doing something they'd convinced themselves was justified, and finds, in the seeing, that the justification has evaporated. Jessica was beside her now. Her pale gold dress looked different to me than it had a moment ago, not beautiful, just expensive. Just bought with money I had earned. "I should have been included in the meeting," I said quietly. "Not to the room. To my mother. Just to her. Whatever you needed to discuss about the company, you could have come to me." I have never once refused to have that conversation. Her jaw tightened. "This isn't the time. You chose the time. You scheduled it for tonight." I kept my voice level. "On my birthday. At a party I didn't know was happening." The cluster around us had widened, almost imperceptibly, the way people create space at the edge of a private moment without being conscious they're doing it. Marcus Webb had gone still. David Chin looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who understands now that they were brought here under false pretenses. My mother began to speak, and what she began to say was an appeal to the room, to my unreasonableness, to the drama I was supposedly creating, and I recognized the move instantly because it was one she had been making my whole life. The quick pivot to victimhood. The reframing of her own behavior as a response to mine. I had spent a long time being redirected by that pivot. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I just waited. And in the waiting, in the absence of the apologetic withdrawal she expected from me, the appeal lost its footing. It dissolved without an audience. Because the people in that room, my professional contacts, her social friends, were watching, and what they were watching was a woman trying to make a daughter responsible for consequences she had created herself. Within 40 minutes, The gathering had thinned significantly. Marcus Webb found me near the end, shook my hand again, and said, "Low enough for privacy. Call me next week. We'll talk about the Harbor District properly." He left without saying goodbye to my mother. David Chin left shortly after, with a look in my direction that I understood as acknowledgement. He had not been a participant in whatever this evening was supposed to accomplish, but he was perceptive enough to understand what he'd witnessed. The development company's regional director left without speaking to anyone. My mother and sister stood in the now depleted room, and the caterers moved around them with the quiet efficiency of people who have worked events that ended badly before. Jessica's phone had disappeared into her bag. Her face had the particular quality of someone who is recalculating everything very fast and finding the numbers don't work. I picked up my coat from the hallway. I turned in the doorway. "I'll have Harold send formal notice about the shareholder meeting protocol," I said. "Future conversations about company governance should go through the proper channels." My mother said my name. Just my name, nothing after it. I looked at her for a long moment. Looked at the room, the lights, the expensive flowers, the space I had funded. "Happy birthday to me," I said quietly and closed the door. The calls started before I reached my car. My mother first. 3 calls in the 7 minutes it took me to walk to where I'd parked. I let them go to voicemail. Then Jessica twice. Then my mother again. I drove home in the quiet of my car with the phone face down on the passenger seat and the radio off, and I noticed that I felt neither triumphant nor destroyed. I felt, with a clarity I was still getting used to, completely present. My apartment was dark and quiet when I arrived. I turned on the lamp in the kitchen. I fed the succulents, a habit I kept even when I had no reason to, and then I sat at my kitchen table and listened to the voicemails. My mother's voice, in the first message, had the particular quality I had feared my whole life: wounded, righteous, barely controlled. "Sarah, I don't know what you think you accomplished tonight, but you embarrassed this family in front of people who—" I stopped it there. The second message was quieter. More real, I thought. Stripped of the performance. "Call me, please." Jessica's first message was silence, almost entirely, and then, "That wasn't, I didn't think you'd," and then nothing. Her second, "I'm sorry." Just that. I listened to all of them once, and then set the phone down and made tea and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the city lights, and thought about my father. About Sunday evenings in his study. About the way he had looked at me, with attention, with genuine interest, with the particular love of a parent who recognizes themselves in their child and finds that recognition joyful rather than threatening. He would have been devastated by this. Not by what I'd done. I thought he'd have understood that, eventually. By what they had done. By the shape of the thing his family had become in his absence, the transactional architecture that had replaced warmth. But he was not here, and the devastation was mine to hold or to set down. I called Harold the next morning. "I'd like to restructure the family trust," I said. "I want fixed monthly allowances established, clear, non-negotiable, not tied to company performance. My mother will receive $3,000 a month. Jessica will receive $1,500. Both sums are sufficient for a reasonable life and completely remove me from any ongoing financial obligation." I paused. "The property payments will end. The discretionary supplements will end. Everything that requires my ongoing decision-making ends." Harold was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant reduction from the current arrangement. It's a sustainable and appropriate one. Your mother will contest it. She's welcome to. The shareholder agreement is airtight. You said so yourself." He considered. "Give me a week to draft the documents properly. I have time." The calls continued for several days. My mother's trajectory was, in retrospect, entirely predictable. Wounded righteousness shifted into bargaining, then into something that presented as remorse, but retained, if you listened carefully, the quality of a negotiation. "I never meant for you to feel excluded. I was just trying to understand the business better. Jessica and I were worried about the future. We thought maybe if we had more involvement." I listened to all of it. I did not respond with anger. I waited until the messages had finished, and then I called my mother back on a Thursday evening, 10 days after the party, and I said, carefully and without drama, exactly what I had prepared. "I love you," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not doing any of this because I don't love you. I'm doing it because I've been giving you things: financial support, professional trust, emotional patience, for 10 years without any reciprocity, and I can't continue to do that and remain a healthy person." My mother was quiet. "The trust restructure means you and Jessica will have steady income that doesn't require anything from me month to month. You won't need to call me about expenses. You won't need to plan around my decisions. You'll have your own stable foundation." 3,000 a month is not, she stopped herself. "It's not what you're accustomed to," I said. "No, I understand that." I kept my voice even. "But what you're accustomed to is never sustainable, and I should have established these boundaries years ago. I didn't, and that's on me." She was quiet again. "Then, are you closing the door?" I thought about that for a moment. Really thought about it. "No," I said. "But I'm not leaving it unlocked anymore. If you want a relationship with me, a real one, not a financial one, that conversation is available. But it starts over. And it starts without the company in the middle of it." She didn't respond to that directly. She said she needed time to think. I said that was fine. I don't know what she decided. We spoke twice more in the following month: brief, careful conversations, nothing resolved, nothing broken further. A beginning, maybe, of something that had never existed. Or an ending disguised as beginning. I genuinely didn't know which, and for the first time in my adult life, I found I could tolerate not knowing. Jessica sent me a message 3 weeks after the party. Not a call, a message, which I thought showed a certain self-awareness about what kind of communication I was likely to receive right now. "I've been thinking a lot." I knew it was wrong. I kept telling myself it wasn't, that we were just protecting the family, that you were always so caught up in work that you didn't really need us to consult you. But I knew. I think I knew for a long time that what we were doing wasn't okay. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I don't know if that means anything right now. But I am." I read it 3 times. I didn't respond that night. I waited a week because I didn't want my response to come from the immediate place, the still raw place, but from somewhere I'd thought through properly. When I did respond, I said, "Thank you for saying that. I'm not ready for a full conversation yet. But I'm glad you said it." And I meant it. Both parts equally. The month after everything happened, I did 3 things I had been delaying without acknowledging I was delaying them. I rebooked the trip to Portugal I had canceled 2 years earlier because a deal had come up that couldn't wait, a trip I had planned for myself, alone, because I liked to travel alone and had never quite admitted it. I cleared 4 weekends in my calendar that had been blocked for work availability, and I left them empty. And I bought a record player, something I had wanted since my late 20s and kept postponing for reasons I could no longer remember. These were small things. I knew they were small. But they were mine, selected for no one's comfort but my own, and when the record player arrived and I put on an album my father had loved, something jazzy and unhurried, and sat in my kitchen on a Saturday morning with my coffee and my thriving succulents, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But the precondition for it. The clean, specific sensation of a person who has stopped spending themselves on people who aren't counting the cost. I had built an entire company from the ground up. I had restructured debt and renegotiated contracts and spent years working before anyone in that building trusted my instincts. I was good at building things. I knew how to start with something broken and make it functional, and then make it something worth having. I was 34 years old. I had, for the first time in my adult life, a reasonable amount of energy that wasn't already allocated. I thought I might see what I could build with it. There is something quietly devastating about the way Sarah described those Sunday phone calls, their consistent length, their predictable content, the inquiry into her health that functioned as maintenance rather than love. She had cataloged them, unconsciously, with the precision of someone keeping records on a professional relationship. That is the story beneath the story, not the betrayal, exactly, but the long preparation for betrayal that had been ongoing for years, accepted as normal because normalizing it was the only way to survive it. What Patricia and Jessica did was not a sudden rupture. It was the logical extension of a dynamic that had been in place since Sarah's father died. From the very beginning, they had received her as a function rather than a person, the one who handled things, the one who could be counted on, the one whose emotional needs were secondary to the material comfort she provided. The secret meeting, the group chat, the plan to dilute her shareholding, these were not betrayals born from nowhere. They were the inevitable outcome of a relationship in which Sarah had never been perceived as someone who might one day stop. The family had made a fundamental error of category. They had confused dependency with power. Because Sarah paid for things, they assumed she needed them more than they needed her, that the financial arrangement gave them leverage rather than exposure. What they had failed to account for was that dependency only generates leverage for as long as the person depended upon remains unaware of the dynamic. The moment Sarah saw clearly, their position inverted completely. But the more interesting question is why it took 10 years. Sarah was not naive. She was one of the more perceptive people in any room she entered, professionally, analytically, strategically. Her blind spot was not intellectual. It was emotional, and it was specific. She had attached the experience of being loved to the act of being useful. Her father had loved her, and he had also treated her as a capable intellectual partner. Those two things had fused in her understanding of what love looked like. And so, for 10 years, she had expressed love through competence, through provision, through the consistent demonstration of her usefulness, and had been waiting, without quite naming the weight, for those expressions to be received as love in return. They weren't. They couldn't be. Because the people receiving them weren't interpreting them as love. They were interpreting them as service delivery. This is the accumulation effect that the story ultimately illuminates, not a single moment of cruelty, but hundreds of small exchanges in which Sarah gave and received nothing that mattered to her and filed the absence away. Each Sunday call, each dinner where her achievements went unmentioned, each occasion where her mother said, "We don't know what we'd do without you," and meant something closer to "please don't stop." These weren't dramatic betrayals. They were the slow erosion of a person who kept showing up and calling the showing up love. The financial restructure Sarah imposed at the end was not punishment. It was, in the truest sense, a correction, a return to accurate accounting. She removed the hidden subsidy she had been providing and replaced it with a transparent, bounded arrangement. In doing so, she gave her mother and sister something that looked like less, but was actually more honest, a clear picture of what they had, instead of the distorted one they'd been living inside. What can't be known yet, what the story wisely declines to resolve, is whether Patricia is capable of the kind of relationship Sarah has left the door open for. Whether the woman who spent years treating her daughter as a resource can learn to see her as a person. The devil's advocate reads Patricia not as a villain, but as someone whose own capacity for connection was perhaps always limited, who loved in the only way she knew how and had no framework for recognizing how insufficient that was. That doesn't absolve her. But it complicates her. And complicated people occasionally surprise you. Sarah's final image, the record player, the coffee, the Saturday morning, is the right ending for this particular story because it is so deliberately unheroic. She didn't vanquish anyone. She didn't repair anything. She simply stopped pouring herself into a vessel that couldn't hold her. And what remained, once the pouring stopped, was space. Her own space. Quiet and uncertain and entirely hers. That, ultimately, is what 10 years of overgiving costs you. Not the money, not even the time, but the accumulated smallness of yourself that results from perpetually fitting around others. The work of rebuilding is not dramatic. It is the Saturday morning. The record player. The succulents. The slow, undramatic practice of existing for no one's benefit but your own. What stays with me most, thinking about Sarah's story, is not the party or the group chat or even the shareholder plot. It's those Sunday calls. 12 to 20 minutes, every week for 10 years, covering what Patricia needed and what Jessica was doing, and almost never what Sarah felt. We talk a lot about big betrayals, the dramatic moments. But sometimes the real damage is done in the ordinary ones. In the questions that were never asked. In the birthday that was quietly reassigned. In the daughter who rebuilt an entire company and was never once asked what that cost her. Here's what I think the hardest part is: Sarah loved them. She genuinely did. And love, when it isn't received as love, doesn't disappear, it just turns inward and becomes something quieter and sadder. It becomes the thing you're still hoping for even when the evidence says to stop. The bravest thing she did wasn't crashing the party. It was sitting in her kitchen afterward, in the quiet, and letting herself have a Saturday for the first time in 10 years. That's not a small thing. That's everything.